cool.
Yeah. So we'll
Yeah,
see.
it's like special.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, she thought it was amazing. What about you? Where are you at with those?
Same.
Yeah.
I get my Utah gas.
Uh-huh.
So is this Hebrew?
Yeah.
Yeah. You can read it.
Depends on what
Yeah.
part of the Bible.
So interesting.
Most of the vocabulary words that they teach you in Hebrew class are Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Core Class. And tonight we're going to, this is our second time together studying the basics of biblical justice. So thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us at home. Before we start, let's open up with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to study your word, and specifically this aspect that you are interested in. Study of justice. Please guide us as we look at your word tonight and give us understanding. In Jesus' name, amen. Last week we talked about the Noahide laws and mentioned how those are applicable to the Gentiles, and that was decided by the Jerusalem Council, if our understanding is correct, that that's what they were referencing. But it's definitely something that is part of Jewish tradition. But I wanted to mention that in regard to the Noahide laws and also the laws of the Sinai covenant, at no time are we to understand that these have anything to do with salvation. Okay? Paul makes this argument in many places. In Romans chapter 4, he talks about how Abraham was justified by faith. He believed God, it was credited to him as righteousness, and the law was never intended to bring about salvation. The purpose of the law, in either case, is to give the people of faith, those who believe in God, instructions on how to live, and thus demonstrating that they are believers. So those who are Gentiles would follow the Noahide laws, and they are demonstrating that they believe in God, and so they abstain from certain things. And if you happen to be Jewish and you're part of the covenant, you see yourself as observant, then the laws that are part of the Sinai covenant, all of them would pertain to you, and that is the way that the Jewish people maintain their distinction from all the other people of the world, because God has a covenant with them, and they have certain rules also. Granted, you can follow these rules, maybe because you were raised that way, and not necessarily be a believer. So as you can see, it doesn't necessarily correlate to one's salvation. So I just wanted to make that distinction, that you don't, get that personal relationship with God by observing the law. Actually, those who have the faith, believe in God, are going to observe the rules that apply to them, and thus demonstrate it. It's an example of their faith. So, I have to say that the notes seem a little bit cumbersome here. That's because I basically took my own personal notes and put them in outline form, and then removed things which I didn't want to talk about. But there's going to be more here than what we're actually going to discuss. So if you like, if you want something to do, hold on to this, and any verses that we don't cover, go through it on your own time, and you may pick up a few things there. So I'd like to start with an overview of the Sinai covenant. Now, the Sinai covenant really extends all the way 40 years into the covenant that was also established on the plains of Moab before the next generation actually crossed into the promised land. So you probably remember from last week, we mentioned that God has this, seems to like the third month as the month for establishing covenants. That's when the Noahide covenant was established. And in Exodus 19, that's where we learned that the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai in the third month. And this is where God made his offer to them. I find it interesting that after all he had done for them, he is now going to make the offer of a covenant. Maybe he was demonstrating his power to convince them that, yes, you can trust me. But there at Mount Sinai, he, through Moses, he makes the covenant or he offers the covenant that if you serve him only and obey his commands, that he tells the people of Israel that out of all the nations of the earth, he will be my treasured possession. And that is what Moses then took to the leaders, and they agreed to it. They said, yes, we will do what the Lord says. And so then they prepared for the next day when they were going to receive the Ten Commandments. And that scared them greatly. That's when they told Moses, you need to go up on the mountain and get the rest of the instructions from God, because between his loud voice and the fire on the mountain, this is going to kill us. So that's what Moses did. And he went up and received the rest of the information. This is then in chapters 21, 22, and 23. He wrote all this on a scroll, came down, and then we read in chapter 24, he presented all this to the leaders again. And this is where they had their opportunity to ratify the covenant. Okay, so they made the initial response to God's offer. They got the whole story, Ten Commandments, and what is known as the Book of the Covenant. That's all those chapters, 21 through 23 of Exodus. And then they offer sacrifices, and they ratify the covenant. And so therefore, for that generation ratified it really for all generations. It's a generational covenant. Okay, so that's the good news. Then as we move on, we get to chapter 32, and that's where that whole thing with the golden calf happens. And this is devastating because they've already broken the first two rules. They worshipped other gods and they made a graven image. Now, at that time when Moses came down, well, actually, before he came down, God told him this is what's going on. It says these people have already broken the covenant, and I'm going to destroy them. That means the deal is off. If God is going to destroy them, they're no longer going to be his chosen people, his treasured people out of all the nations of the earth. So Moses comes down from the mountain with the tablets, and you might think he did this in anger, but I think there was a reason. He took the tablets and smashed them on the ground, broke them. It wasn't just something he did in anger. The covenant was broken. That is essentially the same as ripping up the contract. Sometimes someone will say, well, you did this, now this contract is no longer worth the paper it's written on, and you rip it up. Well, with Moses, the contract was written on stone. So he smashed it. It's no longer valid. It's over. Now Moses, and this is not going to be the last time he does it, acts as a mediator. He goes and intercedes for the people to God. And this is where he talks to God. I think God looks for people like this. I mean, sometimes God wants to show mercy, but I think he needs someone to speak up for the offending party, and that's what Moses did. He spoke up for them. And we see in chapter 34, we get new tablets. And in chapter 34, you also see much of the same things that are written in chapter 23 of Exodus. So there is, it's like the reestablishment of the covenant. You need the new tablets, you need a new contract. However, in these situations, even though there's forgiveness, things don't always go back exactly the way they were before. And when you read in Exodus chapter 34 and verse 27, there's an interesting little addition that he's making this covenant with Moses and the Israelites. You notice the addition of the name Moses? It's as if this contract, remember, because he said he was plan to start over. He made all these people out of one individual in the first place, out of Abraham. So he's willing to start over. He can do it. But Moses intercedes. And so this second covenant, I like to call it the revived version, or it's not really revised, but it's revived. It's the same covenant, but it seems as though in chapter 34 there's a cosigner. So if the Israelites default again, he goes ahead with his plan B. Unfortunately, as it turns out, Moses is the one who doesn't make it into the promised land. So that's where it's at. Then something like this happens again. This is over in Numbers chapter 14. This is where they send out the spies, Yeah, and the spies they go into the promised land. This is only like, remember, the promised land was only an 11-day journey from Mount Sinai. So this is probably like 11 days after they left. They stayed there, and we see them leaving in Numbers chapter 10. But Numbers 14, they send out the spies, and they bring back a bad report. All of them except for two, Joshua and Caleb. And this is enough to scare the people, and now they're talking about deposing Moses and going back to Egypt because they're afraid of the giants that are in the land, as if Egypt is going to welcome them back with open arms. This is enough to tell God to throw, for God to throw in the towel again, and he's willing to destroy them. This is if he has them at the door and they're not willing to go in, what's the point? It's over. Once again, Moses intercedes for them. It's an interesting watching this dialogue between God and Moses. Moses understands him, and he convinces him to not kill them all off and start over again. And so it's a study in and of itself to see the leadership of Moses and his role in all of this. But once again, things, even though there's forgiveness, things don't go back exactly the way they were. That's the problem with this. So at this point, they were saying that God, the bad stuff they said about God is just terrible, that he just brought them out here to kill them, to let them die in the desert and all this. I mean, it was just really, they're passing judgment on his character. So he hears this, and yes, he's going to reinstate, he's going to maintain the promise, this covenant with them, but he's going to give them exactly what they were accusing him of. This generation that broke the covenant is going to die in the wilderness, and he's going to then let the second generation go into the promised land. So even though the Sinai covenant is going to continue, it's going to continue without this generation. So these are all youngsters now that are going to eventually go into the promised land. They need someone to raise them. And that's really the reason for the 40 years of wandering. He's waiting for this generation to die off. And 40 years later, they make their way up on they initially came on the south side of the promised land. Well, 40 years later, they came on the eastern side. They came up by Edom and Moab, and they come into the plains of Moab, and this is where this is the context for the book of Deuteronomy. Everything, Moses recounts everything in the book of Deuteronomy. He recounts their journeys, things that were said at Mount Sinai. And then in chapters 12 through 26, he gives them additional rules, additional decrees or ordinances, and the judgments that correspond to them. And so there's actually a whole other set of laws at that time for that generation. So if you have your Bibles, open up to chapter 26. This is at the very end. I think Moses wrote, it's in my opinion that some of the stuff we read at the end of Deuteronomy actually happened first, where Moses writes all this down, and what we're reading in chapters 12 through 26 is what he probably read from his document that he made to the leaders. So this is after he's read all this. They have to ratify the covenant again, because this is additional material now. This generation has to re-ratify this before he allows them to go in. So chapter 26, in verse 16, or starting in verse 16, this is really the bottom line of the contract, so to speak. The Lord God, your God, commands you this day that you follow these decrees and laws, speaking of the ones that he just gave in chapters 12 through 26. Carefully observe them with all your heart all your soul. You have declared this day that the Lord is your God and that you will walk in his ways. See how it says you have declared? That's their ratification. That's their agreement. Now there's a ceremony for this, which actually is documented a little bit later. But so they have declared that they will walk in his ways and keep his decrees, commands, and laws, and that they will obey him. Verse 18, the Lord has declared. So now this is his signing of the contract. He has declared this day that you are his people, his treasured possession. The exact same words that we found in Exodus 19. That you are, and that you are to keep all of his commands. He has declared that he will set you in praise, fame, and honor high above all the nations he has made, and that you will be a people holy to the Lord your God. So that's the new contract. And specifically, turn over to chapter 29. There's a little line here which is important. Chapter 29, verse 1. These are the terms of the covenant. Everything he's mentioned, actually from chapter 12 through 26, all the way up here to the end of 28. These are the terms of the covenant the Lord commanded Moses to make with the Israelites in Moab. That's where these were delivered. In addition to the covenant he had made with them at Horeb on Mount Sinai. So that's where the two things are joined together. What we read in Exodus, Leviticus, parts of Numbers, and then in Deuteronomy. And that then becomes the Sinai covenant. So, let's get down to business here. The 10, really what I want to show tonight is, one, that the 10 commandments really are the main commandments, and everything seems to be a delineation of those. And I think there's a reason why these are listed as the top 10. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. In number 2 in the outline, I just want to mention a few things here. You're seeing the Hebrew portion there. Everything here is from Exodus chapter 20. And you see the word there, davarim. Okay, that means, that's the plural of the word davar, which can be translated in many ways. It's a very versatile word. It actually means word. It can mean item. It can mean issue. Sometimes it's even translated report. But where I have it highlighted here is where you see that word. In verse 1 is where it says, and the Lord spoke, and God spoke all these words, saying. And so the word that's highlighted there, as you can see, is, that's the word davarim. Reading from right to left, okay? And the reason I have that highlighted there is because in the verses that follow, this might be why you read different things in different translations. In Exodus 34:28, it says that, and he wrote upon the tablets the words of the covenant. And then it says the 10 davarim. Okay, when you look at that highlighted word, there's a word that comes before davarim, that's eseret. It means 10. So very often in your translations, they may just say the 10 commandments, but it's not the word commandments, it's the 10 words or the 10 items. And it's the same thing over in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13. He uses the same phrase, eseret davarim, the 10 words. So sometimes in Jewish circles, you'll actually use that. Well, they'll use the Hebrew, but sometimes you'll see them use the phrase, the 10 words. And it's referring to the 10 commandments. And it's based on what we read in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1. He spoke these words, these davarim, and so it became the 10 davarim. What I have listed there below is reflects how there are different views at how the commands can be divided up. And it usually has to do with whether or not you should include verses 2 and 3 together. This first commandment should be verses 2 and 3, or should it just be verse 2? And then the ones that follow would be verse 4 through 6, or is it verse 3 through 6? You can choose whichever one you want, as long as You realize they came from God. But I think there's a reason to accept view one. So the first half of the Ten Commandments are often divided. The Ten Commandments are often divided this way. The first half is responsibilities toward God, and the second half is responsibilities toward man. Now, as we mentioned last week, the second half compare very nicely with the Noahide laws. So it's actually building upon existing laws. Something else, though, depending on how you segregate the commandments, each commandment in this section has that phrase, the Lord your God. This is how it supports view one. If that first half of the commandments have that phrase, the Lord your God, that's his covenant name. You notice that that word Lord is in capital letters. That's the tetragrammaton. Some people translate it Jehovah. But you don't have that with the second half. And so that might be a reason for dividing them up that way, and how the first half really is more specific to the Israelites. And the second half is, well, they have to follow it, but it actually existed by way of the Noahide laws even before this time. So, as I mentioned here, these commandments are also listed in Deuteronomy chapter 5. So, let's dig into it. And as you see in the outline here, you see that phrase, or you see the letters DP. That's just my own convention for designating the death penalty. And I think that's the reason that these are chosen. Many of these laws are delineated in places, like, for example, I consider the commandment to not murder as a personal injury law. There are many personal injuries that don't require a death penalty. There's compensation. But murder is probably the ultimate personal injury, and there's a death penalty associated with it. And that's true of many of these. In fact, we can confirm 8 of these, 8 out of 10 for sure, have a death penalty associated with them in the worst case scenario. So let's look at the first ones here. Also, one other thing. You see I have like 2 columns. So each of these items, A, B, and so on. On the left side, I have a verse next to the verses cited in Exodus. Those are just there for additional reference. And we're not going to read all of them, but the death penalty where it says DP equals, we will definitely read those because I want us to see where that's actually referenced as a capital offense. So let's look at the first one here. This is verses 2 through 3. When the Lord spoke these words, the Devarim, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So that's the first one where God is saying that they are to worship no one else. Now, some say, there's a difference between monotheism and I believe the term is monolatry, where they did, when you read the scriptures, they acknowledge that there are other deities, at least others that people worship. So they acknowledge that those that people worship them, but they are to worship their God alone and worship and serve him alone. They're not necessarily saying that there is no other heavenly beings, but he alone is to be worshipped. I'm actually going to take these two together. Let's read 4 through 6, and then I'll talk about the death penalty stipulation. So the first one is that he alone is God. And this corresponds with what we read in Deuteronomy about the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. That's something that's confessed every day by those Jews who are observant. So the second one, in verses 4 through 6, you shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, there's that covenant name again. And with jealous God punishing the children for the sins of the father to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. The reason I read these together is because the death penalty, I think, is mentioned in the same place. I have two references here. I just want to look at the first one. They're both in Deuteronomy. Let's turn over to chapter 13. Okay, we're not going to read all this, but I just want to show you that it's segregated. It really works out. You're probably, you see 3 paragraphs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Starting with verse 1, then verse 6, and verse 12. The first one has to do with a prophet. There were actually prophets, or people who were considered prophets, that might not be believing in the one true God. And that's what he mentions here. If a prophet or one who foretells dreams appears among you and announces to you a miraculous sign or wonder, and if that sign or wonder of which he has spoken takes place, which was really the test for a prophet, right? But he says, let us follow other gods. You must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. Go down to verse 5. That prophet or dreamer must be put to death. Even a prophet, if he were to then switch and say, let us follow other gods, he's not exempt just because he's a prophet. Then in verse 6, even if your own brother, basically a family member, or your son or daughter, your wife or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, let us go and worship other gods. Verse 8, do not yield to him or listen to him and show him no pity. You must not spare him or shield him. You must certainly put him to death. Interesting, your hand must be the first one to throw the stone.
Mm-hmm.
And then in verse 12, it broadens out a little bit more. If you hear it said about one of your towns, the Lord your God is giving you to live in, that wicked men have arisen among you and have led the people out of their town astray, saying, let us go and worship other gods. Then you must inquire, probe, and investigate. I'm glad that was mentioned. It's probably got to be done in all cases, but we actually have it written here that you don't just fly off the handle and execute justice. You have to investigate. Maybe it's not true. So you have to inquire, probe, and investigate it thoroughly. And if it is true, and it has been proved that this detestable thing has been done among you, you must certainly put to the sword all who live in that town and destroy it completely. Now, no doubt, you might think that this is a bit rash, especially when we live, as we do, in a pluralistic society where there's freedom of religion. And we might say, well, that's kind of harsh. But I think if we looked at it another way, it makes a little more sense. God, in setting up this covenant, bringing these people out of Egypt, God is not doing all this to start a new religion. He's not building a religion. He's creating a nation. That's important to remember. When you're creating a nation, I like to think that you need 3 things. You need land, you need laws, and you need lots and lots of people. And he's provided all those things. He created all these people from one man, 2 million. And now he's going to give them the land which he has actually set aside long ago. It was told to him, it was told to their ancestor, Abraham, 400 years in advance that he was going to give them this land. And now he's giving them their laws. So if we understand that this is not about setting up a religion, but he's creating a nation and setting up and establishing a nation of which he is king, then this worshiping other gods is not so much a religious thing, but it's a political thing. It's an act of treason to follow another god. You remember in, I think it's in the 10th chapter of 1 Samuel, when the people asked for a king, and Samuel's quite despondent about it. He goes to God, and God says, don't feel so bad. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me as their king. Up to that point, he had been their king. And so, in any society, if someone commits an act of treason, what is usually the punishment?
Is it death?
Yes.
Oh.
Depending on the country, it might be quicker than in others.
Right.
There may not be an investigation in some cases. But if you understand it this way, that this is God's nation, he is the king, and to worship another God needs to follow their rules too. It's an act of treason. Then all of a sudden it doesn't seem so unfair or cruel, because this is his nation, and these people are to be set apart and different than all others, and this nation is his chosen, treasured possession. Any questions on that?
Yeah, can I? I mean, so like, what do you think is happening to the covenant itself when Moses is adding to it after they've already had a chance to enter into the promised land? Like, they could have gone in back in Numbers, and they didn't have, at least as far as we know, that addition, Like, why is it coming at this point? Do you think this is like Moses' commentary on it? Is this like the covenant is the covenant is the covenant, or what?
I can only give you my opinion.
Right, no, that's fine.
That does require additional study, and I don't know what others have said about it. But I have asked that question myself. Had they gone in initially 40 years before, would there have been additional rules? Because much of what we read in Deuteronomy is something that they can only practice once they're in the land. So it kind of makes sense that they didn't get it before. Maybe it has something to do with God's foreknowledge, that they weren't going to go in. And so why give them this information? If they had, I would suspect that he would have given them that information. I believe, even though when Moses writes all this down in Deuteronomy, chapters 12 through 26, he doesn't specifically say he got it from the Lord.
Yeah.
I would assume that he did. I don't think Moses would have, come up with these things on his own. He was a man under authority himself. So yeah, I don't think Moses is adding those things. But that's the only thing I can offer. It's a good question. Okay, let's move on to verse 7. You shall not misuse, or as some say, take the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Okay, how many of you think this has something to do with using bad words? You laugh.
That's what it was applied. Yeah.
That's usually what we hear, right? Or using swear words that contain the word God. I always found that one interesting, because usually when I hear people say those things and people say, don't take God's name in vain, my thought is God's name isn't God. I never once heard God's name actually used in that context. This actually has to do with taking oaths. And that's when you would actually use God's name. So let me explain this one a little bit. Let's turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 13. So this is right in keeping. It's chapter 6 of Deuteronomy is referred to by some as the sermon version of the first commandment, because he really elaborates on this. But in verse 13 he says, fear the Lord your God, serve him only, and take your oaths in his name. And this probably really is using the term oath in a general sense, because there are oaths and there are vows. And an oath really has more to do with something you would do in court, giving your testimony. And you're giving an oath about something that you have done or said. Whereas a vow is a future event. If the Lord, like for example, the fellowship offerings had a vow component. Someone who made a vow would give a fellowship offering. And that often is what they would do. If the Lord does this, I'm going to offer a fellowship offering. And so if God does that, you have to fulfill your vow. There are other things too, and I think some of this has to do even with civil contracts, making that, sealing a deal, for example. So it's interesting because this is a way of incorporating God in every aspect of life, giving testimony, maybe even in business dealings. Now the thing is, then if you make a vow or take an oath, especially in a court of law, and you invoke his name, and you lie, commit perjury, or you don't fulfill the vow, then you've taken his name in vain. And that's what this is about. It's a very serious offense. In fact, it actually states that he will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. He's like the witness to that agreement, even if it's not something that you're doing for him, but you're taking an oath in a courtroom. He's then a witness to that, and you used his name. Let's also turn over to Jeremiah chapter 12. There's some mention of it there. We actually get the formula here.
Jeremiah what?
That's Jeremiah chapter 12, verse, well, let's start with, let's just verse 16. We won't read the whole thing here. And if they learn well the ways of my people and swear by my name, saying, as surely as the Lord lives, even as it was once taught my people to swear by Baal, they will now, then they will be established among my people. So apparently sometimes people were taking their oaths in Baal's name. But that phrase there, as surely as the Lord lives, is an oath formula. And you see that a lot. Someone saying, as surely as the Lord lives, I think Eli said this to young Samuel. Yeah, you need to tell me what the Lord said to you. As surely as the Lord lives, I will deal with you ever so severely if you don't. Or sometimes making promises to conquer their enemies. Surely as the Lord lives, I'm going to exact revenge on such and such a group of people. They're actually swearing. It's like they're saying, I swear to God, like we do. Only it's a little more binding there. But I don't know if that's exactly the way they would formulate it in a courtroom setting. But that's an example of how it was done. This one, you can see here, I don't have a death penalty associated with that. And I think the key to understanding that is what God says, that the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Apparently, it's up to God to render the judgment for someone who does that. That's all I can make out of it, because I don't see a penalty that is actually going to be applied by the human judges. Okay, wow, a fun one. Let's go to back to Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day, keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son, daughter, manservant, maidservant, animals, or the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and earth and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. This is part of the section which applies to the Jewish people. Okay. Now the key to understanding this, now this is where I'm going to look at some extra stuff. You see that I got a reference there to Exodus 31. This is the thing that the Lord was talking about right before the golden calf incident. There's some important things here. This is chapter 31, and let's start with verse 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. Notice how it's got plural. It's including the Sabbath day. There were other days of rest. This will be a sign between me and you for generations to come, so that you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. Actually, I think I'm going to cheat here and cover the death penalty that's associated with it, so I'll just keep on reading. Observe the Sabbath because it is holy to you, and anyone who desecrates it must be put to death. Whoever does any work on that day must be cut off from his people. Go down to verse 17. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. Let's first of all talk about this sign thing. This is why I think it's not only because it's in the first half of the Ten Commandments, but right here God says it's a sign between me and Israel. So it's uniquely tied to the Jewish people. Now, I tried to figure out what the sign might be. And you got that other handout. These are excerpts. It's not the whole reference to Sanhedrin 97. But there was an understanding, even among the ancient rabbis, that the 7 days of creation meant more than just God doing something in 7 days. It could very well be an indication of how long human history was going to last. You can see that I've got another reference there. We won't turn to them in the interest of time. Psalm 90, verse 4. 2 Peter, chapter 3, verse 8. Both of those talk about how, with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. Well, that one in Psalms was of particular interest to the rabbis, and so they saw the 7 days of creation as indicating 7,000 years of human history, of which the 7th millennium would be a Sabbath. And that's where we get the 1,000-year reign of Christ. So here's what some of these rabbis have said. Rabbi Katina said, 6,000 years shall the world exist, and 1,000, the 7th, it shall be desolate. As it is written, the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. Abaye said, it will be desolate too. Now, there's not always agreement with these guys, so keep that in mind. As it is said he's quoting another verse. This is actually from Hosea chapter 6, verse 2. After 2 days he will revive us, and on the third day he will raise us up and shall give us sight. He saw that as understanding as a 3,000-year period. As it has been taught in accordance with Rabbi Katina, just as the 7th year is 1 year of release, because they had a 7-year cycle. Remember the Shemitah, the 7th year they would let the land go without plowing and harvesting, release all the servants, and forgive all the debts. So that would be corresponding also to the 7th millennium. So the world, 1,000 years out of 7, shall be fallow, as it is written, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. And further said, a psalm and a song for the Sabbath day, meaning the day that is altogether Sabbath. For 1,000 years in his sight are but as yesterday when it is past. And there he's quoting that psalm, the psalm we just read, Psalm 90. I left the footnotes in for these, so in case you want to follow up on those. And then the last one, the Tanya Deve Eliyahu, which Eliyahu means Elijah, and not the prophet, but that's how you say it in Hebrew. The world is to exist 6,000 years. In the first 2,000 years there was desolation. 2,000 years the Torah flourished, and the next 2,000 years of the Messianic era. But through our many iniquities, all these years have been lost. But the point of this is that this was an understanding that this corresponded to the 7,000 years of history. If you want a little more information on this and maybe a few more Talmudic references, I got a little link at the bottom there. It's kind of interesting. So the reason I bring this up is I think this might help us understand why God is so interested in them resting and why he says it's a sign. Because I think in the seventh millennium, all prophecy is going to be fulfilled. Everything he's doing with the world, everything he's doing with Israel, all that will be done. And I think, and this is my own opinion, okay, take it for what it's worth, that when the Jewish people celebrate the Sabbath, if it is really a sign, as God says, I think it's a sign of something that's to come. And I think what they are actually doing is commemorating a future event, the fulfillment of all of God's work. They're commemorating that time when the seventh day or the seventh millennium will come to pass. And it's kind of interesting that in those days, when Christ sets up his kingdom on earth, there's peace for 7,000 years. There will be a people in existence who have been commemorating it ever since Sinai, looking forward to it. So I think that's the sign between God and Israel. Another reason this might be so severe that it would incur a death penalty is that no one ever accidentally goes to work. Because when it says to rest from your work, the word there in Hebrew is malachah, and it refers to your regular work, like your occupation. So, like I said, nobody accidentally goes to the office. Nobody accidentally plows a field or accidentally harvests. You make a conscious effort. So if you've been given specific instructions to rest on this day, since work is not something you accidentally do, it takes a conscious effort, that would imply rebellion. And we do have one example in Numbers chapter 15 where somebody actually did this. And like I said, I think he was out gathering wood. Nobody does that accidentally. He obviously was showing blatant disregard for the commandment, which shows he's breaking the covenant. That's something to keep in mind. When the people of the covenant break a commandment, it's not just a sin. It's a violation of a promise. It's a violation of the covenant. We think of it as just breaking a rule. But these laws that we're reading are part and parcel of the covenant. In fact, in Deuteronomy, Moses calls the tablets upon which they were written the tablets of the covenant. It's the document, and it's the relationship the special relationship that the Jewish people have with God. So there's much more to it when violating it, if you're part of that covenant. We already read the death penalty association. There's another one in chapter 35. So we won't go over these, but you'll see below this under some point D, there are only 4 references in Torah as to what work is. So a lot of this had to be decided by the rabbis or by the leadership. The ones that we have here really have to do with regular work, whether it's kindling fire, agricultural activities, leaving the one's place to acquire the manna that they did. Remember, they were specifically instructed not to do that on the Sabbath, and then gathering wood. So let's move on to the next one. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 20, and we'll look at verse 12. Verse 12 is to honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God has given you. Again, here's one that pertains to the land. So this is specifically for the Jewish people. Now, that's not to say that Gentiles don't have to respect their parents, but you don't have severe penalties for disrespecting one's parents. And there is a death penalty associated with it. It's right over in the next chapter. Chapter 21, verses 15 and 17. If anyone attacks his father or mother, he must be put to death. And in 17, if anyone who curses his parents, they must be put to death. Now again, like anything else, this would require investigation. And in the Mishnah portion of Talmud, the rabbis had to deal with, well, what constitutes a cursing? What constitutes an attack. You get into an argument with your parents, that I don't think that that's what it's talking about. This has to do with, normally a physical abuse would be a personal violation, and that's covered. You would have to compensate the person for any injuries. But it's a little more severe with parents. And they would have to, they actually do in Talmud define what has to take place to constitute an actual attack of child to parent that would warrant such a penalty. We'll talk more about that next week because we're going to go through the laws in chapter 21. Chapter 21 is all the personal injury laws, and so that we'll cover that a little more next week. So let's move on to one thing I want to mention here, that this is important because the parents are the primary individuals who pass on the Torah. And that is a child's first dealings with authority. And so the authority has to be understood within the home. And if someone's not respecting the authority in the home to the point where they're actually cursing or physically assaulting their parents, what kind of a citizen are they going to be? So I think this is also nipping something in the bud before it affects the rest of society. So let's move on to verse 12. I'm sorry, that's the one we're on. Let's go to verse 13. Verse 13 is where we get into some of the commands that were already mentioned in the Noahide laws. This one is thou shalt not murder. And the penalty for that really goes back to Genesis chapter 9. That's where the death penalty was first instituted by God. Up until that point, this is where we also feel that God established human government to give human beings the authority to execute. Also demonstrates that they have the authority to execute lesser penalties and to impose lesser penalties. We covered that last week about how God established human government. But that is the penalty for that crime was already established back then. But it's also mentioned here in chapter 21, verse 12. Anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death. So he's basically continuing with that death penalty for actual murder. Now, one thing I like about this is that we get, remember I said last week that we had these Noahide laws, but it was understood that if you wanted to know more about it, you'd study the Torah to get the delineations of those laws. And I like this, we'll cover next week, but there's the whole subject of the cities of refuge and what do you deal, how do you deal with second degree murder? When you kill someone unintentionally. This is where God looks at the heart. He demonstrates that by understanding that not all death, when someone causes the death of another person, is intentional. And that has to be recognized in the courts. And we'll cover that more next week. So, that's the death, that's the reference, though, in the next chapter for the death penalty for murder. And again, like I said, murder is the ultimate personal injury. And chapter 21 deals with other personal injuries. So that's what we'll be covering next week. The next one is verse 14. Thou shalt not commit adultery. This is the ultimate sexual sin. There are other ones. And if you want to see the other the lesser, or I want to say lesser ones because some of the other ones can result in a death penalty also. You'll find that in Leviticus chapter 18. We actually looked at one of those last week. And the penalty for those sexual sins are also found in Leviticus chapter 20. Now with this one, actually, we're going to cover some of that. So I do want to point out, though, in the biblical understanding, adultery must involve a married woman. Okay. When you read all the various laws about such things, it only makes sense if you understand that other things are considered fornication. So that helps to understand that principle when you're looking at sexual sins in the Torah. Yeah, actually, we're moving right along here. The next one is verse 16. And that's you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. This one, you might not be readily apparent how this could result in the death penalty. It normally would not. But let's go over to Deuteronomy chapter 19. There's, I believe, a certain situation where this could result in a death penalty. Deuteronomy chapter 19. And let's start with verse 15. This has to do with witnesses in a trial. One witness is not enough to convict a man accused of any crime or offense he may have committed. The matter must be established on a testimony of two witnesses. And now here's our verses of interest. If a malicious witness or a false witness takes the stand to accuse a man of a crime, the two men involved in the dispute must stand in the presence of the Lord before the priests and the judges who are in office. This is where these oaths come into effect. The judges must make a thorough investigation, and if the witness proves to be a liar, giving false testimony, then do to him as he intended to do to his brother. You must purge the evil from among you. The rest of the people hear of this and be afraid, and never again will such an evil thing be done among you. Show them no pity. He reveals the life for a life, eye for an eye principle. We'll cover that part next week. I like this. If a false witness accuses someone of stealing something, and they are proven to be false, well, the penalty that would have been incurred by that individual had they been guilty now falls on the false witness. It shouldn't discourage anyone from being a false witness. So my contention is, what if they accused him of murder? What if or some other offense which would result in a death penalty? I think in that case, this would require further research, but I think this would be a question of, would then that false witness have to be put to death? Because had they succeeded, it would have resulted in the death of an innocent person. So, it's good not to be a false witness. And the last one we're going to look at, the 10th commandment. Let's go back to chapter 20. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant or maidservant, his ox, donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. This is the other one that does not have a death penalty associated with it. Remember, the other one was taking the name of the Lord your God in vain. That was sort of left up to God. God said that God will not hold anyone guiltless. So whatever happens is his business. This last commandment is interesting because there are no penalties for it. I don't find penalties for it anywhere. And the reason being is that, in my opinion, it's a matter of the heart. How do you prove someone had bad intentions? How do you prove that someone coveted? I think that this commandment serves as a principle. For example, if you don't covet your neighbor's wife, you'll never commit adultery. If you don't covet your neighbor's car, you'll never steal it. Anything else that you might covet that is your neighbor's, that might cause you to kill him to get it, you'll never commit murder. So it's a nice reminder that this is really what leads to these other crimes. is covetousness, or the desire to have something. I think James is tapping into this idea. The writer of the book of James. In order to understand the passage there, we need to explain something. The Hebrew that you see there is the word lod tachmod. And it really, lo means no. Chamad is the word for covet. Now, what you see there, LXX stands for 70, and this means the Septuagint translation. Is where the Bible, the Old Testament, was translated into Greek. And they translated the Hebrew word chamad, to covet, as epithumia. Well, in this case, it's epithumeses. So it comes from the word epithumia. It's passion or desire. And if you look at that word, you see that in James chapter 1, verses 14 to 15, I put it in bold because he uses that exact word. So when you see that word, you could almost substitute, if he was Jewish, he was probably thinking chamad and writing epithumia. So it's the same idea. And so, roughly translated there, it says that each of us, when we are tempted by our own epithumias, by our own chamad desires, we are lured and enticed. And in verse 15, and then when epithumia, this passion or desire, is conceived or it seizes us, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully accomplished, you actually carry it out, brings forth death. So there's a process there. You're carried away by your own desires, and then you plan to carry it out. That's really the sinful part, because if God looks at the heart, he sees what we plan, and he sees that covetousness. Now, I don't think that this chamad, or these epithumia, these desires, are really about fleeting thoughts that a person might have. I certainly hope not. I think this has to do with someone who actually has committed themselves to performing whatever sin or crime they're thinking about. People have fleeting sexual desires. People have an occasional desire to choke a coworker, or anything else. You see something that you like. Maybe it's a car or a stereo. You think about it and you want it. Maybe it's somebody else's. Why don't you do it? It's because you've judged that action. You've judged yourself, and you've decided this is wrong. So that's why I don't think this commandment is about fleeting thoughts. However, if someone actually planned it out and didn't fulfill it, this is where God sees the heart. This word is also used in the New Testament in the book of Matthew. Actually, in both cases, when you read Matthew, when he's talking about a man who looks lustfully at a woman and desires her in his heart, he has already committed adultery. In the Greek, it uses the word epithumias. And you heard me mention last week that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. And the Hebrew copy uses the word chamad. It's exactly the same word that we find in the 10th commandment. So if you look at a woman, if a man looks at a woman, this again is assuming that it's a married woman, and chamad, and desires her, he has committed adultery in his heart. And I think the understanding there, again, is not some fleeting thought, but he actually plans on carrying it out. Look at it this way. Let's just take a case of robbery. Say you want $1 million, and you actually plan to rob a bank. So you get your cohorts together, you make the plans, and you arrive at the bank, and suddenly you find out one of your coworkers comes down with COVID, and it just wouldn't be safe. So you call it off, and you end up never doing it. this would never stand up in a human court. This actually corresponds with much of what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, where that verse that we looked at, with many of the things where he says, you have heard it said, but I tell you, when the part where he says, you have heard it said, are things that you can be tried for. You can be tried for in a human court. But when he says, but I tell you, he's personalizing the Torah, and that those things are things which will never stand up in a human court, but they will stand up in the heavenly court. And so in this particular case of robbery, you can't take someone to court for planning it and actually driving to the place that you were going to rob, and something fell through. But the desire was there, you were ready to take action, it just didn't work out. My understanding of the 10th commandment is that would be tried in the heavenly court, because God sees the heart. He knows the desire. And again, I think this 10th commandment serves as a warning that even if, let's just say you actually committed a crime and never got caught, God sees. He sees the action, he sees the heart, and it serves as a warning, I think, that even though the 10th commandment is never going to be tried in an earthly court because there's no rulings on it, that doesn't mean that the person who commits these crimes or desires to do these things is going to get away with it. There's still a heavenly reckoning, day of reckoning for these things. So don't even desire them, and you won't commit them, and you won't actually have to stand and account for them in the next life. And I think that about does it. Do you have any questions about anything that we discussed tonight?
No, I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
So like I said, these are categories, I think, of which they are the worst of the categories, and thus requiring the death penalty. So next week, in chapter 21, we're going to look at specifically a personal injury law, which is really relating to murder and everything less than that. Now there, we're actually going to get rulings. There's different scenarios, and there's different penalties. And in essence, what God is doing is establishing precedents. I'm impressed with what he leaves to human beings. You know, back in Genesis chapter 9, he set up human government. I'm impressed with how much he trusts us. He really thinks we can do it. Demonstrates that he really did make us in his image. And here he's giving so much. There's so much that's not mentioned in the following chapters. I mean, there's nothing in there about software piracy, identity theft, or anything like that. You couldn't possibly write everything. But what he's doing is he's giving the initial rulings and setting a precedence, from which human judges can then continue on in that same vein. And very often you'll see that in the Mishnah, they're doing that. They're always referring back to something that God has said, and they want to keep in line with the precedents that God has set and how he ruled on something. And so next week we'll see how he ruled in regard to personal injury law. All right?
Cool.
Great.